My name is Simon Ings. I'm from New Scientist. I edit the culture pages there. We have 3 presentations, essentially, and then a discussion. I'd first like to introduce Adam.
First, thank you for the invitation to come speak to artists, scientists, engineers, technologists. I'm a firm believer that what I want to accomplish in my research, which is in the neuroscience of how a part of our brain called the cortex works, is really going to come from these discussions and not discussions with a bunch of other neuroscientists. We're roughly out of good ideas, and discussions with people that are exploring this space, truly exploring it, are by far the most useful for my science right now. In exchange for your ideas, I want to teach everybody here 2 things tonight about what this part of the brain, cortex, does, why we have it. I think there are just things that everybody in art, science, and technology needs to know. And I'll try to lay this out as clearly as possible. Some of you may know already, but it's a good refresher. I will also discuss, because I can't prevent myself, about what knowing that about cortex implies for the technology we should have. Maybe we have some of it already, or maybe we're moving towards it. But I think there are very concrete things one can say, which will be controversial. So going way back, this is a vertebrate brain. All vertebrate brains have this same basic structure. It's divided into 3 pieces, which we name the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. It's very simple. Your brain looked exactly like this when you were 5 to 10 days post-conception, so you're still in your mom. A fish brain still looks like this. The hindbrain has connections to the spinal cord and thus the muscles, and it's the center of generating the movements that allow you to walk, turn, if you're a fish, swim. The midbrain is where information from your senses arrives, from your eyes, your ears, and so on. And if information that a piece of food is nearby, the midbrain will tell the hindbrain, perhaps you should turn towards that. If the food is slightly too large and moving suspiciously, maybe it's a predator, I should swim away. The midbrain and hindbrain do a very, very good job of keeping the animals that they're controlling alive and reproducing in the environment. The forebrain is a mysterious structure. Even in fish, it continues to be mysterious in ourselves. If you look at the forebrain, it's just generally active, doesn't have much to do with the sensory environment, doesn't have much influence over your behavior. And in a fish, it's relatively small, so generally, it's not studied very much. Why it's important can be seen as you follow what happens, keep track of the very tip of the forebrain over the course of the last nearly 500 million years of evolution. So as you see here, scientists are intrigued by the forebrain because it's the structure that gets very, very, very large. And about 70 million years ago, the brains of mammals generally had this structure. The very tip of forebrain is an intriguing place that I think you all need to know about, and it has a special name, some of you may have heard of this. It's called the hippocampus. This phenomenon of folding back in on itself, that the forebrain basically accomplished through an evolution, continues even at the level of the hippocampus, and it's curled up into a structure that somehow looks like a seahorse, hence the Latin name. If you look at the hippocampus, it's always been an intriguing place for neuroscientists. What is this tip of cortex doing? Generally, we started by looking in rats. If you look at the activity of individual neurons in the hippocampus and you ask, when are they active? While the animal runs around some environment, in this case, the classic is a maze, it was discovered in the 70s that cells in the hippocampus are only active at a particular point in space. They called them place cells because they're active at some place. You change the environment, a new map of these cells will appear, and throughout the hippocampus, there was a representation of the spatial environment. It didn't matter how the spatial environment was understood. It could be in the dark, and you'd find the walls, it could use smell. It didn't matter how you were oriented. All the experience needed was summarized in the hippocampus to give a representation of the environment that was arguably very useful for a rat to navigate and survive in new niches that opened up for mammals 70 million years ago, a little later, the dinosaurs suffered a meteor attack. This relationship between hippocampus and space is vital, becomes more intriguing when we look at what the hippocampus does in you and I. A lot of what we know about this comes from one patient, and similar, who in the 50s were suffering from a severe form of epilepsy that starts in the hippocampus and could not be treated in any way that they'd had at the time. The idea was maybe if we cut out the hippocampus, we'll be able to alleviate the epilepsy, and generally things will be okay. Let's see what happens. So they did this to HM in 1953, and his epilepsy went away. He lived for almost 60 more years, very, very happy, generally had a normal life. Spatial navigation was slightly affected, perturbed, had a hard time finding his way around. But what's most fundamentally fascinating about HM in patients who had similar removals of the hippocampus is he never formed a new memory. Every 5 minutes, he would meet his same doctor, clinician, wife, and introduce himself. Without his hippocampus, he could not store new memories. This connection between representing space and how we store all of your experiences is a fundamental feature of how the brain, in this particular case, the cortex, has organized information. I think this is a really important lesson for how we build the technology that is presenting us with increasingly large amounts of information. Now, we can ask, is this the format that we want to use for organizing information in the modern era? Completely devoid of spatial context, other than the 2D arrangement of as many icons as you can fit on your screen. We have removed spatial context from information because that's what our computers needed in order to present it to us. And by doing so, we have severely handicapped a system our brain spent 400 million years creating for contextualizing what happened to you when and where based upon where you are. My commitment as a neuroscientist moving into more technology is what would a world look like with what should technology do for the hippocampus? And I think my clear statement is no more screens. We need to free our information from this 2D environment that was consistent. As I say, now using a screen here to make a point about the fact that they should go away. And we need to find ways to do that. This will make it much easier for your brains to understand a world of increasing complexity. Now, my favorite example is I go home at night, reading a book before I go to bed. And not only is all of my books now stored on the Kindle app on my phone, I don't even have the paper structure of that copy. The books are blurring together in my mind, as I'm sure they are for many of you. And I miss the days of having multiple heavy things dragged onto a flight with me just because I wanted to read a few novels on the beach. But I didn't realize, and now I do, how important it was that one book was thicker than the other, had some torn edges, had a funny tear in the dust jacket. I needed that context to help store information about what I was reading and learning. I want it back. Fortunately, there are now proposed for us a bunch of alternatives to the screen model. Awkwardly, they look a little like strapping a screen to your face. Fair to the technology, clever use of tracking systems and adjusting what you see on the screen as you move your head, as many of you have experienced even tonight. VR and AR really prioritize spatial representations in the content that they create. And I want to discuss the potential for these things, but also the potential pitfalls. One for VR that we've discovered in the lab is that in a virtual environment, the real world has largely gone away. What consequence does having a discrepancy between the real world that your brain has spent much of its life representing, what objects are stable, where they are, what you could run into, is that slippery, and replacing it with a virtual space, which you can believe is real, but how much work do you have to do to deal with the difference between the two? And so this is something we explored in the lab, and for some of you who came to our Play Lab session here, what are the consequences for the brain as more of the real world is progressively hoovered up into the virtual environment? And we're doing research studies now that are beginning to show that as you have more cues about the spatial context, it's much easier to move around in a virtual environment. We leave this as it feels very different in the VR world to bump into something that you see before you hit it versus hit something that was unexpected. AR feels like it doesn't have this problem. You can see the real world, and you can put whatever virtual content you want on top of it. And a lot of the hype now of companies like Magic Leap, HoloLens, really is supported by the idea that AR is going to be a more comfortable future for brains than just straight VR. Pitfalls. To explain the pitfalls of AR in my remaining 5 minutes or so, I need to tell you about the next stage of brain evolution. 70 million years ago, we were here, roughly the rat brain. It continued, this forebrain explosion. So much so that the forebrain never really fit inside of the skull and had to curl up on top of itself. And about 5 million years ago, you arrive at something that looks like the familiar human brain. It's rotated, likely because of what forebrain is capable of. We chose to stand upright, tilt our heads down, and you're used to seeing a picture that looks like this. Forebrain got much larger. The important consequence of this for designing tech is that also a section of it now got direct control over movement. A connection between the forebrain, or an area called motor cortex, directly to muscles really began to emerge in primates. Why is a research question we've been asking in the lab for the last almost 7 years, starting in Lisbon. And our solution is the worlds that became available to primates required a much more detailed understanding of the dynamics and the movement and physical structure of their environment. And thus, at the consequence of taking much longer to figure out how to move, giving cortex control over movement meant you can move around safely in more complex spaces. There's a more important consequence of giving cortex directly control over muscles, and that is what happens when you put two cortices in view of one another. In this case, the movements of one cortex are directly visible and accessible to the other. If cortex is moving your muscles and not mediated through the midbrain and hindbrain, then the ability for two cortices to coordinate what information they have, to communicate, is massively increased. And this connection, I think initially, so primates could live safely in trees where no other heavy animals could, was a precursor, a prerequisite for language. Clearly from language, cortices coordinating with one another, a social coordination, you get society. What it means to be a human brain is not what one human forebrain can do and figure out about the world. It's what a collection of them, well coordinated, can achieve. If you imagine what you would be as a brain living back in the trees, you would be a cold, poorly climbing monkey. Society and groups of people getting together to share ideas, this is really what is distinctly unique about humans, our ability to coordinate. Human society relies on cortical coordination. So what does technology do for social coordination? And we all know about this, right? Social communication via the screen suffers, and we have reduced a lot of the nuance of what I can show you with voice, with my movements, directly from my cortex, so you can build a model in your head that's similar to mine. It's harder to do via WhatsApp. Well, what about in VR? They'll get there, but I think we have a ways to go to have the social cues and coordination possibilities that are available in our real life accessible in virtual environments. It's a good research project, but there's a lot of nuance in how I move, how I stand, how I sound, and we need to be aware of that before we move entirely into the metaverse. In the context of AR, where again, we could see directly the social cues coming from the other, whoever we're communicating with, as well as virtual content. This is a more nuanced point, but nicely, an experiment was already done on how will AR affect social coordination. We called it Google Glass, and it basically concluded, this is creepy. It's quite strange to communicate with another who has access to information that you don't have. We find this untrustworthy, and if you think about our sense of fairness and cheating is really burned into us over those last 5 million years of being a coordinating species. if we can make this work, a bunch of people standing around a room sharing a similar augmented reality and designing a new operating theater, apparently, without one person not being suspicious about whether this guy is secretly checking his email or looking up detailed facts about whatever. This might be our future. I grant you, Magic Leap, your magical reality might very well be what's in store for us. But it will require relaxing some of our sensitivities. Maybe we're willing to do this in the post-truth era, about how we verify what we collectively know. I want to ask what technological future does what does our Cortex actually want? And if I'm going to be very harsh about it, I think it's neither AR or VR. It's certainly not a screen. And for that, I'm just going to tell you what I think it should look like. Okay? Technology must provide spatial context. You need your information in the structure of the space that you're actually in. We need to find a way to do that. And it has to be really easy and perhaps even facilitate our ability to coordinate socially. I have a lot of ideas about how to do this. I've heard many more good ones from even people here tonight, and I'm very interested in figuring out how to let's take this scene. The world I want to live in, the world I want my young children to grow up in, will have both of those features. So I'm going to ask you to imagine a scenario of the world that I would like to build. Here you are in a room. It's a living room. In the evening, you may decide you want to watch a movie on TV. You absorb yourself into the world presented to you by the screen, and that's your consumption of the content prepared for you. Going back to my story about the Kindle I would like, let's say I chose to read a book, I would miss out on some of the augmented details I could get from a virtual reality experience of Blade Runner, or even just watching the movie itself. But I propose there's maybe something we can do with this technology, which is I would like to pick up my Kindle, my tablet that has a copy of the book I want to read, but I would like to get with that a whole bunch of augmented context, not just viewed through a bunch of goggles. And the world that I'm now shifting, beginning in parallel to build as a neuroscientist, is one where my technology has access to the space that I live in and has the ability to provide context in an augmented way directly in the environment I live in. So I call this project, uniquely, if you follow the subtle references throughout this, related to this machine that shows up in one of my favorite books, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, called the Voight-Kampff machine, which is somehow my last name connected to a company that built a device to distinguish artificial intelligence from real biological intelligence. We have no idea where Philip K. Dick pulled this name out of a hat, but according to Blade Runner, by November 2019, I'm supposed to invent a device with some guy named Voight that can tell whether you're an AI or not. And so that's what we're going to do. We started the Voight-Kampff project, you can see here. And if you are interested in helping build a technical future that fits for real brains, send me an email. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Adam. Hello. Dylan Yamada-Rice, as I say, was a senior tutor for information experience design at the RCA.
I work part-time for a company called Dubit, who are based in Leeds. We make content for children. And even if you're not interested in children, I think there's a lot that we can learn from them, particularly because they are very playful. They often verbalize everything they're thinking, whereas adults are a little bit more cautious. And they're very good at making the boring fun for not having any kind of boundaries. And so the adults in this space are often saying, close it down, stop kids doing this, let's make some guidelines, let's make some rules. Yes, we don't want them to fall over, you know, do we want them to be educated in this space, and all these kind of things. And then the kids are saying, let's push away all those boundaries and see what we could actually do with this. And I think that's where there's a lot of crossover with art as well, and that sort of pushing of boundaries to see, okay, what if we do fall over, so what? Those kind of questions as well. Okay, so if you're interested in knowing about the research, I've been working with children 8 to 12 years old, looking at how they engage, how they interact with VR, also some of these health and safety issues about how it affects vision and the constant screen and things as well. And you can download the full report here. So again, I mean, one of the things that I noticed going in is that kids move a lot more than adults do. So adults go in and they're quite cautious and they try to get used to the space and the context, whereas kids are like in and they're right into that world and moving around. And when you step back, they actually look like they're performing some kind of contemporary dance. And again, I think we all often sometimes have this assumption that the virtual space is somehow in isolation. So when we talk about context, we're imagining people in this space with a screen, perhaps alone. Whereas even when we're not at the stage of having these glasses and we can design the kind of surgery space together, children are still using them collaboratively. So that idea that we're all bringing our brains together and wanting to work together on something. So if you watch children play, just physically, they'll add in ideas, they'll bring in props, they'll try to make it a better experience. And in virtual reality, they're doing the same thing. So here we have one child who was in VR in the game Job Simulator, one child who was out. And the child who's out is making the story and adding to what the person in VR is doing. And they're saying, like, you know, pick up this, throw that, you know, look behind you, and all these different kinds of things. So it was really social. So when people were saying, oh, they're really worried about people spending a lot of time in these isolated spaces, I think that's kind of not what at least not what I've seen. And this links on to one of the first things that I want to say. So when we talk about setting context, I think there's a lot of space where we try to recreate the real, and actually maybe that's missing a beat. So at least for all these kids, they were most interested in being fully immersed in the unreal. So if you're going to go into a rainforest, you can still see a documentary, you can go to the rainforest, you can, you know, all these things to allow you to experience the rainforest. But if you went to the National Theatre and saw Dotland, for example, you could put on a VR set, sit on a toilet, go down the toilet, come out into a party with a Cheshire Cat. Now, you can't do that in real life. And that, for me, is what makes VR exciting. So when you talk about these contexts, maybe we don't need to know who we are. Again, I don't know. I'm not this cognitive background. But maybe it's about accepting that in particular spaces, the same as when you read a comic or when you read a book, you allow and suspend reality in your imagination to take on a different role in that space. And then you come back out and experience what is real. So again, this is me playing around. So in Google Earth VR, when we watch kids, they go in and the perspective is different. You're floating around in space and they're like, whoa, why have you put me here, like floating around here? And then the next thing they do is see a planet and they try to lick it. And they're running around the room, licking things, including my shoe, trying to understand what that virtual planet tastes like. And when I think back to what I know about young children and childhood development, that idea of putting stuff in your mouth and trying to make sense of materials, it is a human experience. So if you have no understanding of a particular material, you use your imagination to think about what it most closely relates to. And at the moment, as I was saying to Adam before we started, at the moment that relates to the physical. So we're going back and, you know, I was trying to sort of think in my mind, is it like a bit like a dip-dap or something with the scale, and is that why they're licking it? But then my 10-year-old son has played a lot in tilt brush, and we had some sparklers the other day, and he was waving them around, and he's like, wow, this is like tilt brush in real life. So suddenly, you know, he's making sense of the physical material that we hadn't used before in relation to the virtual material. And when you think about children using iPads, for example, when they would go up to a screen when they first came out and try to swipe every screen, and then they'd go up to a book and try to swipe every book. So I think we are making sense, and we still have these objects in our lives and we have screens in our lives, and we hybrid across the two. And I'm going to skip this slide because it's a bit dull. I think what we're trying to do is to use all the materials that we have access to make the best experience, whether that's real or fictional, on whatever platform. So when you watch kids play, even with an app, they might put on the sound of an app and go and get their Paw Patrol car or whatever and bring it around and just use the sound of the app. Or, I don't know, superheroes are banned at school. Can't play with them. What am I going to do? I'm going to find little bits of rock on the ground, and they're going to be like Star Wars dust, and off I go. And so as humans, I think we're interested in this blurry boundary of what could be, I suppose. And so I guess I'm just here to try and make the case that the unreal is potentially very exciting. So the comic theorist Scott McCloud, who you might know, says that when you look at something that's very real, maybe your brain has to do this extra work as well, which I find interesting and don't know much about. But it can only be one interpretation. So this is a man, it's not me, it's nobody I know. But this person, well, it could be anybody. You know, it could be an animal, a person, we don't know where they're from. So suddenly you're able to layer on your own experiences and turn it into anything you want it to be. And so I think in the virtual space, having the ability to be able to do that is what makes it exciting. And again, so when we talk about these contexts, children wanted to make contact with everything, so the licking was just the, the start of it. So again, when they were in this Google Earth, you know, they saw trees, they wanted to stamp on them, they saw little tiny cars, they wanted to pick them up. And then as the research went on, they started to say, you know, why don't you make something physical to make that actually possible? So when they were like floating in the air and some of them were like scared, they're like, who made this? Why didn't you put a little platform here and then I'd feel fine, you know? And so I think, again, that whole thing of the physical and the virtual combined is really interesting. And I've just succumbed and bought a Nintendo Switch. I love the idea of Labo. So that idea, again, that you've got the very tactile and the physical, the need for materials and objects with the screen. And you know, I'm sketching in a notebook. I'm typing on my computer. I'm thinking about what is the best experience for each platform. And so, again, children wanted these physical objects. So we played around. This is a game we developed for Adventure Time. And even just having the headset with a character on allowed role play to come in a slightly different way as well. So I just started taking part in this MakEY project, which is looking at makerspaces and children's roles in the maker movement. And one of the things that I've always thought about with the maker movement is what makes those spaces very different from working at the RCA or working in an art school, and it's mess. And this is, again, what we were talking about before. So that kind of human desire to take apart and make a mess and try to understand. You don't want kits, maybe. So it's, again, those kind of blending. So early on, we started to think about how we could use the Vive tracker to take in physical toys that children would make in makerspaces and play with in virtual reality worlds that they'd also created themselves, to see how they would play across the two things. Now, it was much more complicated to work out how to get the tracker to work than I was capable of. And meanwhile, I had all these kids waiting. So I was like, OK, we're going to do something slightly different whilst I'm trying to figure out how that all goes on. So we gave physical materials to children and asked them to imagine a world for a connected toy. And then we asked them to replicate it again in Tilt Brush, to think about creativity in these different spaces. And right away, you know, children were sort of saying, drawing as if it was a canvas and there was an end, but then suddenly they like look behind and they'd be like, but now I've got yellow here and I want yellow there, and I'm going to have to fill it in for hours. And then other people would come in and say, well, if you were going to tell me that I could draw in light, I would have done something completely different. So again, one more version of this was just to say that this child's world here, he had made a spaceship, and the spaceship for this wooden toy that we had asked him to design for was corroding. And he got into tilt brush, and he was just like, there's no way to make anything corrode in here. There's no similar color. Everything's bright. And he had like kind of a meltdown going, now what do I do? And so we were trying to imagine what corroding light would be like. So I don't quite know where I'm going with this. But again, I think when we think about virtual reality and we think about children in those spaces, there's a real need to allow them to understand the technology, to allow them to understand the possibilities and chances to learn from them from within that as well. So part of this idea of allowing them to create physical toys to take in to the virtual worlds that they create came about because we were playing the game The Blue, where you stand on a shipwreck and you look out and you just see loads and loads of stuff going around. And one child was constantly swimming so as not to drown. And even though I'd say, it's okay, you don't need to do that, because it was like the first child who'd gone in and I was really worried about ethics and stuff, they couldn't stop. And the next child who went in was really terrified of a shark or a big whale as it came by. And they tried to say, I like your fin. You have quite a nice smile. To like try to mediate that. And I started to think, if they could take something that would make them feel comfortable in that space, would they take the same thing? Would they take a rubber ring? Would they take whale food? And that, again, I suppose, just links me into hoping that you'll think more about the physical and the virtual. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Dylan. I think we've got someone here who knows how to corrode light. William, hello.
Hi.
Hi. Come to see you. So, William Latham is probably known to all of you, so I'm going to introduce you anyway, because that's what Compares do. He's best known for pioneering organic art since 1989, a long time. A long time ago. Developed a graphic art style using organic forms that is known through work on the rave music scene.
Yep.
But also in games. I didn't realize you did the thing.
Yes.
It's singularly appropriate. I feel that the thing was merely introducing Mutator to the world. And this is the work that I know of William's best, which is Mutator VR. It's now a virtual project. And is looking at the way in which environments and exploring the way in which environments can take on their own logic, their own aesthetic, their own generative properties. If we're talking about immersing ourselves in the unreal is not necessarily, the truly unreal is the inhuman or the non-human. Yeah. It's the work that can be generated through well, we talk about algorithms, but we're already getting dangerously close to the point where we're no longer talking about algorithms playing out through iteration. We're actually looking at systems that can consider their own algorithms and mutate them. And that's a life's work, and it's still going on, I understand.
Yep, still.
What's going to be the next?
So,
I don't want to spoil your presentation, but so virtual reality just opened up huge opportunities for us. So me and my team are now working on trying to use machine learning to automatically generate the worlds the person is in VR and hopefully enjoying it. So the dynamic space is being created around them in novel ways. So to make it completely addictive is the idea. Lovely.
Okay.
Let's hear more.
Right.
Cheers. That's good.
Right, so I've got 20 minutes. I really enjoyed the previous talks. Dylan's experiences working with children in VR, that was a similar experience to ours. We showed Mutated VR in Russia and St. Petersburg in a big exhibition, and children just absolutely loved it. They were dancing around, swooping away these creatures, these mutoids. So very, very interesting the way children engage with VR. And Adam's talk I thought was extremely interesting because I now know how to address people when they come to a gallery and see an exhibition of our work and they're walking up to try out our Mutated VR experience. And I say, well, I hope you enjoy it, but what we're really trying to do is trick your forebrain into taking you into another reality. So I'm only interested in your forebrain. And our job is to trick you 100% to feel like you're in another galaxy. And our job is really to try and deceive the public, actually, which came clear in my mind as you were talking. So what I'm going to do is try and talk about what we're doing with Mutated VR, and towards the end, touch on how this is crossing over into art and science, and in particular, touch on this idea of what's real and unreal. So being an artist, you get quite used to creating things that is unreal. It doesn't, it's imaginary, it doesn't exist. And when you start working with scientists, you realize that part of what they're doing is real, and actually a large chunk is unreal of everything that they don't know. So this mixture of real and unreal is a sort of recurrent theme. And towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about work we're doing with the Oxford Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine. We're doing work in viruses and things like that. So quite a lot to get through. And I know I've got the clock on me. I guess one of the key things to say is I'm just the front man. We've got an amazing team. Stephen Todd, who I've worked with since I was at IBM, Lance Putnam, RA, Peter Todd, and also Guido tonight, my new PhD student. So I'm extremely fortunate that I've got great mathematicians, programmers around me, ideas that we form together and then articulate them in real time. So Mutated VR is a kind of brand that we've labeled that everything is sort of put under. And for me, it's this little device that has really opened up huge prospects. So I was like in a typical 80s, 90s SIGGRAPH artist in the history books. Everyone thought, well, you've done your interesting stuff. And then this little device came along. And wow, it just opened up a new vista of possibilities. And like a lot of people working in procedurally generated geometry, it opens up new worlds. So this is a shot of our exhibition in Venice, where we have a kind of a gallery situation, multiple screens, a little bit like we have tonight. And in VR, we can place the viewer at the middle of alien mutating flowers. So a few seconds later, it will have changed shape. So here, there's probably about 20 seconds between those two forms. And this is the typical type of view that the viewer is seeing in VR. It's completely abstract, and their smallest body movement changes what happens in the world. They are the performer that actually completes the artwork. They have to, just their smallest body movements will reshape the world around them. This is another view a little bit earlier. There's a sort of Dali-esque element, nice cast shadows, so we can raid the world of fine art when we need to. So in here, actually that mutating form is in like a mirrored space. This is another shot of Venice. So what we do is because they're not Wi-Fi yet, we have these strange umbilical cords that come down from above that attach the person's head to the computer, which is right up in the rafters, which is a powerful PC with a 1080 graphics card. And so the way we present it is a little bit like a science fiction experience. And in some ways, people look at it and say, well, this is kind of sci-fi art. Or they actually say, well, this is like taking magic mushrooms without the bad effects. So people look at the work and actually try and pigeonhole it. And we're definitely interested in that science, sci-fi kind of space. So we have two experiences, one called Mutation Spades and one called Vortex, which both I'll touch on. And the key thing is once people get into the space, it's all about user interaction, actually. How you get that person believing they're in a real virtual space, and it's cause and effect. If they pull a trigger, something needs to happen immediately to confirm that they're present. So on HTC Vive, which is the best Vive, these are the controllers that we have, that we empower the user with to kind of take them into these strange organic worlds. So these are kind of strange. Everything is quite serpentine in the forms that we produce. So moving on, this was so we were invited to show Mutated VR at the 30th anniversary of a famous club that Danny Rampling started. And interestingly, in that venue, we had people having taken ecstasy in VR in this environment, and they seemed to be enjoying it. And all the people who hadn't taken ecstasy were telling us, well, this is just like if you had taken ecstasy. It's exactly the same effect. So, but I've never seen people so animated, dancing around, genuinely believing that these were real, we call them mutoids, that were surrounding them. So this is another. So we get involved in lots of different exhibitions. A month ago, we were showing this at the Crick Institute. So we show in all sorts of different venues. This is an exhibition that we had in Norwich, Russia again. We're going back in time, very, very momentarily. This is where the work all started, these kind of strange obsessional evolutionary drawings. In fact, Olga tonight actually had a table where people could draw evolutionary drawings using these rules, which was really great. And in this instance, I was an artist, going through the art school process, and then I started to use a kind of programming technique to do the drawings. Anyway, I won't go into that, but this is kind of the origins. This is some of the history, large chunk of time working in rave music and in games, finally getting back, doing some interesting work at Goldsmiths. We did a lot of work with large-scale projections, touchscreen projections where people would pick and breed in a Dawkins-like biomorph interface. And then in particular, which was already a kind of precursor to VR, we started to use Connect to tag body points, skeletal body points, and map those onto these strange multi-dimensional structures. And what we've learned, which was quite quickly, is you can have a hugely complicated mathematical structure. People intuitively learn how to control it by using like kind of Tai Chi, yoga-type movements, and they work out how to manipulate this form. So moving on, so Mutation Spades, we put them in a 3D space where they're smallest body movements. So this structure has at least 200 parameters. And so what happens if they move their arms up, the form changes shape. If they move their arms down, it changes shape in a different way. And there's every variant you could imagine between that. So this is what you, on the right-hand side, you can see what they're seeing, but in reality, it's completely intuitive. There's no controls. They just move their arms, and the form changes shape. One of the challenges with this sort of space is it's a bit like being in a jungle. You actually got all this procedural geometry all around you, but actually you can't see a thing. It's like being in a thicket. So we have to use a couple of tricks. So we actually put a giant cutter around the person's head, and we also put another cutter around their arm to actually make sure that the space is cleared around the individual. And then very importantly, we actually give them a light. We give them two torches. One is like a miner's lamp, and the other is a hand torch. And a bit like Georges de Latour's painting, as you're walking around this virtual world, lighting that you're directing is a really good way of reinforcing that you're actually present. The other thing which we do, which people find very disturbing, is we kind of call it the Alice in Wonderland effect, where we can actually distort the size of the space. So we can take the room that you're in, which starts off about this size, and quite quickly we can put you in a box like this. So your reality is completely black outside that box. And at that point, people start to feel quite claustrophobic. So we're playing with perception, and our job is to try and give the audience a bit of a kick, get something back from it. And it's this mixture of real and unreal that and a lot of VR stuff that's happening is just taking like a game engine and making it look like a game. I think the trick is to do something where you're playing with reality. So we try and split things up, so we have real shadows, but the textures on objects, an object moves through the space, they actually pass through the texture, so you get a beautiful rippling effect. Anyway, I won't go into this. So we kind of split out what's going to be real and what's going to be unreal. And then the challenge is that the viewer, when you get it right, starts to feel claustrophobia, vertigo, shock. And actually, it's very interesting. The question is, what responsibility you take for this, or do you just deliver the maximum experience that you can? What's interesting about VR is that traditional art, which I think modern art is pretty dead, it's a statement that gets me into a lot of trouble, is this idea of received content. The recipient receives the content. It's like it's transmitted to you and you appreciate it. And it's a very antiquated sort of idea. In VR, the viewer completes the artwork. Without the viewer, the artwork doesn't exist, but they actually complete it. And the experience completely unique for the individual. In Vortex, we are using some slightly different geometry. So Lance Putnam is leading on this project where we've put the viewer in the same mutated VR organic universe, and we've got Vortex running there, so we can try it during the break and at the end. And in this world, what you're doing is when you pull the triggers, the effect is supposed to be a bit like diving, except in our space, what happens when you pull the triggers, you're actually distorting, you're creating a giant gravitational force which actually sucks everything towards you. Like you're distorting the fabric of space, and then suddenly these mutating forms are swimming past you. It's a trick, but actually people quite often believe them to be real. All we're doing is we're distorting the three-dimensional space that you're in. Moving on very quickly, this is some of the work we're doing with machine learning that Guido is working with us on. And one of the problems with this, when you're in this sort of organic space, it's a little bit like the Rorschach test. You've got all these weird organic forms, and the viewer kind of interprets them. So how we automate that is going to need two systems. One is an advanced Rorschach ink block test to actually, so you can see content, but actually what we're working on right now is some more fundamental design rules, which actually most good aesthetic experiences normally have. I won't talk about that now, but what we are doing is using TensorFlow and all the machine learning tricks that are around to try and do something novel in that area. Given that I've got about 4 minutes, I'm going to try and get through these slides. So one of the key things is, having done all this work, how we then translate this into the science domain. And interestingly, what we've suddenly, over about space about 3 years, we've got a range of different projects. Interestingly, DNA and RNA, they're interested more than anyone anticipated in the structure of DNA. The way the folds come back and touch each other has huge significance in terms of disease, and everyone just didn't expect that. So our strange, complicated geometry is extremely useful to them, to that group, to try and unravel that, to understand that structural biology. And so these are just some of the projects that we're doing work. So Mike Sternberg at Imperial College, he highlighted actually there's quite a lot of similarity between our form-grow grammar and actually the way some of the protein structures form. This is just a highlight on our project with Oxford, more on Imperial. With Ryden at York University, she's interested in 60-fold symmetry, and we actually have some quite similar geometry in fold grow. And with her, what we're enabling her to do is actually sit inside a virus in VR and look out. And the top model is showing all the heat map from that model. Interestingly, we're doing some work with archaeology. We've got a new collaboration with the Francis Crick Institute, which is getting really, really interesting. So in essence, we're also doing some work in touching the neuroscience space. So from my perspective, what's interesting is we learn all about all this interesting geometry in the real world, and it is all fed back into the art. But hopefully we do some good science along the way. So I think I'm at 20 minutes.
As I was writing down frantically how to tie such diverse presentations, but also presentations that connect, but are really, really significant and important and nuanced and mediated and life-changing ideas. I did find myself drawing cats and sacks at one point, because how we begin to converse between these different points of view is quite a challenge. But my starter for 10. Yeah. are you exploring in your work architecture or environment? Because it seems to me that there is a tension, there is a creative tension in the three presentations that we've had between recreating environments in the virtual to be recognizable and malleable and practical, and also realizing the creative possibilities of the environment itself. But neither architecture nor the environment is just passive. It's not just scenery. It has agency. When I pick a book up from the shelf, the fact that I can find the book like that, and if I can't, it's a problem, and it's weird, and where did I put that book? The fact that I have that spatial information in my head tells me that a lot of what I know about the world is because I know where to go and find it. Mm-hmm. And similarly with the environment, it's your responses to the environment shape the way you think about the world. So now I've got to put that into a question. So let me start with you, Dylan. What do you find that with children specifically that they have a preference for the familiar or the unfamiliar? Are they desperate for things like William Latham's? Very scary environment, or
not scary. They have a preference for what they can't experience on any other platform. So that is the unfamiliar. So when you ask children after they've been in what they want to do, they're like, I want to go down the digestive system and see what that looks like. Yeah, I want to know what it is to come out of my own bottom.
We've all been there.
But those kind of things. In terms of the actual context, I suppose I thought a lot about narrative in relation to game design, and that becomes fundamentally different in VR in that we have to embed the narrative into the context and let the person know who they are purely from the context. So you have no idea who you are unless you reflect on the details that are in that environment and that context.
Yeah.
So I don't know, yeah.
So, I mean, this touches on what you were saying about the ability to communicate, to actually create an environment that will become social, that will actually facilitate social interaction, rather than be a sort of kludgy and rather smeared mirror of what we have in the world. Has there been anything in the last couple of years that has enthused you, in particular from the VR point of view? Something that could be developed to actually fulfill that need, fulfill that possibility.
Specifically in the context of social?
Yeah, we'll start there.
No.
Right.
I think I haven't explored it as much to sort of give such a concrete answer as I just did. What it means to socially coordinate what we are doing, what we're doing with the audience, it's a hard thing to... There's an immense amount of nuance. Walk around in a crowd of people outside in Granary Square, and you're paying attention to who's paying attention to what. And you navigate according to all these subtle little rules. And when there's a thing called the Uncanny Valley that you're very familiar with, is that we're fine with smiley faces. As they become progressively more realistic, there's a phase where we want them to be like things we can coordinate with, but they're a little bit off. And that is a very breaks down the efficiency of socially coordinating. To get to the point where we could actually facilitate that, I mean, it's a really nice holy grail. That's a project for artists. I think as a neuroscientist, I can largely say it's going to be necessary. The tools that we just take the generic ones, the Facebooks of the world, they don't do this. No. They have not helped this. But I am certain there are people in this room that can imagine something that could. And I won't use my time to speculate about that, but I'd love to discuss it afterwards.
So the other day I was in a 4D volumetric capture studio, and what was astonishing about that was to put on the goggles, so you're obviously looking at something that is virtual. You're not fooled to that degree. You know perfectly well that you're wearing goggles, but the resolution reaches the point where all the bits of your brain that tells you this is uncanny because it's just a bit off, because let's face it, a lot of our evolution has been spent being able to identify people and getting it right.
Yeah.
So lots and lots of engines in your head are going, watch this one, it's not what you think it is. All those were turned off because this was down to the levels of the pores of the skin. Mm-hmm. And at that point, all the bits of my head that facilitate human interaction turned on. Mm-hmm. So I was slightly sort of a bit too close, entering that kind of distance, and I could feel the heat from his skin. Yeah. The heat wasn't there, but the bit of my brain had turned on. Now, can we ever develop non-realistic, non-volumetric capture systems that, and this is a question for you, William, do you think we can ever create a social environment within Mutator?
Gosh, okay. So we have got doing some work where we can put 2 or 3 people in a VR space. And the obvious thing is to do like a puppeteer thing. You give one person the job of spawning all the geometry and the other person's role is to enjoy it. So that's quite obvious in some ways. So what we're looking at more is you've got both people in VR space, but between them they're actually jointly controlling 500 parameters, which controls the bend and the twist. So it's like they're stuck together with sort of conceptual chewing gum and actually jointly, so they actually become a single entity, one thing. And actually by slightly moving their body, they change one part of the one thing and someone else changes the other one thing. And I think that sort of experience is going to be really mind-bending because you can't do that in reality. People conceive it, but it's quite, it's quite a hard problem technically because you're pushing the rendering engine quite hard. But to me, it's that kind of really mind-bending experience that people will enjoy. And if it works well, people will want to go back for that. So when we showed this in St. Petersburg, the security guard came every morning because he enjoyed being in VR so much in Mutator. Every morning he would come for a kind of half an hour slot before the gallery opened. Yeah. So I think it could, I think that would be the thing, the type of experience which would be novel. And then, whether humans will learn a whole new way of operating in that space. Could the conventions, that's the question, whether they can adapt.
But there's still value in playing that game.
But
whether or not
but humans have got insatiable appetite for new visual stuff, so it's amazing how much content people can handle. Yeah.
And there's also that appetite for the physicality. And did you get a sense with the children that you're working with and the subjects that you're working with that this was a desire for a familiar form to take into an alien space? Or was it much more just the desire for an integrated sensory experience? Why can't there be, you were saying, why can't I pet the trees? Which I think we've all felt.
Yeah, I think so. So when we talk about virtual reality, I mean, in a gaming context, one of the things that we talk about a lot is what would make people come back to the same experience. So if you spend a lot of money making a VR experience, is it a one-hit wonder, which at the moment, because of the expense of the technology, most people don't have it in their homes. Yeah. And so they go in and they're like, wow, amazing. But how many times would you be prepared to play the same thing and not be bored? And also the other end of that is watching children where there's smell added, there's sound added, there's like a sub-pack on the chair and stuff's vibrating, and how underwhelmed you are when you can't use your imagination enough. So I think people are very critical. I think AR, similarly too. So when Pokemon Go came out, there was that big surge of the excitement of Pokemon Go. And then after a while, it was just people who were interested in Pokemon or interested in gameplay, and they turned off the AR part because it ran their batteries down, but they wanted to play the game. So do you know what I mean? So we get used to things and bored with them very quickly, I think. And in terms of VR development now in the games company, we're very much interested in it being a gaming arcade experience where you share a game with somebody else in the VR space, not something necessarily that will be embedded in the home. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, absolutely. And the Adam, the Void Kampff project, the Voight Kampff interior that we saw. Could you tell us something about how that domestic space becomes, presumably, it's not just that it's got the pretty lights on, it is a transactional space with transactional facilities within it. So can you tell me something about how you see the space becoming transactional, if you like?
Yeah. One thing that it's going to be, and I'm going to be harsh again, because it's just convenient. It's impossible to fake haptics. In VR, the ability that the kid would like to stand on a platform and it really be a platform, if it's really there in the real world, that's fine. But if you wanted to build a haptic virtualizer such that you can pick up this glass and squeeze it and it feels right, but in reality you're wearing some gloves with some actuators, doing this is okay, but you can't make a table. It's impossible. To make, it has to produce infinite force. And you could maybe have a robot running around underneath you when you push in VR. But these are scary environments. I have no desire to fake haptics. I think we should use the physical structure of the world that we're in. And honestly, I love all these tools and technology, but I think we can do better. Right now, this projector is 10,000 lumens. I've become very sensitive to absolute light levels. There are about maybe 25 other lights. Otherwise, it's dark. Voight Kampff wants control over every single photon, and then we can do some ridiculously interesting stuff. It's a lot of rendering engines. It's initially very expensive. It's not going to be in everybody's home, but in an arcade context, and I would like to see, I have a real world where the information embedded in that structure is under the control of people like you guys. And I think that's the future we should have.
But just to be controversial, I think you can throw as much tech at something as you like, but it's not necessarily going to make a good experience, right? So in that kind of haptic thing, for example, a lot of people in tech are like, yeah, get the haptic gloves, get da-da-da-da. You watch kids and they're like, I'll be your haptic person. Yeah. You want to touch that fridge? I'm the fridge. I'm right here now. Push against me. Try and close me. You know, so we look for the technological solution, whereas actually the social bit is already there, doing what the...
I think the experience as we're exploring it in VR, as people are discussing what this would be like in AR, as I would like it to be in a Voight Kampff space, whatever this means. That needs a ton of work. People have much more experience than I. I just want to be able to, I want one thing. I want you guys to figure out how the world my kids should grow up in, how to train them well. I have thought about that. But I actually want to have the context of when I did stuff, when I read something on my phone, when I went to this website, when I learned, when I was at this talk. I want to carry this with me into my space.
But don't you think everyone's brains are rewired already? You know, to me, the reason why everyone's on their phones is actually humans quite enjoy this experience. You know, so I noticed everyone, you know, in the late 80s hated computer art. Absolutely, you know. People, then by the time everyone had been using their phones for about 15 years, everyone sort of understood what computer art was about. There was a change in what people were. So I think everyone's brains they've already been rewired by sending so many emails. And, you know, the amount of information everyone's handling every day is just going up and up. We still, you know, and people seem to quite enjoy that, actually. I think so. To me, like, you know, the VR is like the purest experience of all that other stuff. Yeah. But that's my personal opinion. I'm slightly biased because I've been working in computers for 30 years.
If I would give a 10-minute longer talk, I would talk exactly about this. I'll just briefly say, in that midbrain, it's very old. There's a structure called, it's a midbrain dopaminergic nuclei, and they have different names, different species. Yeah. In that is the center where, you didn't talk about these drugs, but opioids, cocaine, heroin, so on, actively, and they basically cause these dopaminergic neurons to be active. This is an experience that people report as being very pleasurable. It's the same experience as having somebody like your photo you posted on Facebook, or having the ability to get certain kinds of loot boxes in video games are a means of making you, it's active when something unexpectedly good happens. That system is super old. Yeah. People enjoy that system. It's also, I think, one of the more problematic ones to target as a means of creating value, in that it's old, it's hardwired, it's the one that's connected to both addiction, it's also never satisfied. It's a fish brain's assessment of what's good in the world. Now, I would add, the forebrain has this other system for finding something good. It's when its model of the world fits together, and your art captures this well. It wants to be able to comprehend as much complexity as possible in a way that is manageable. I can get control over those dimensions, and I can do something with it. Now, I will say this from the large-scale empirical experiment I ran recently involving 1 billion people. We basically just Google and you search on YouTube for most satisfying video. If you do this, you get a long list of the most satisfying videos. Every single one is an example of a very intricately, and I don't know how to describe it otherwise, satisfying physical interaction. It's watching a physics engine play on a bunch of planks falling and the thing settle into a nice pattern, or somebody cutting very smoothly through a piece of cake. It just feels, that is, your cortex finds complex models fitting together. There's another reward system for that. And that's the one that I think is,
Okay.
they're thrown together. We call them both good and valuable, but I think cortical good is one that I think I want to work towards.
Is that why kids like slime?
That's, yes,
could well
kids,
be, yeah.
if you look, a lot of the content on kids' YouTube, I know that's not intimately, some of it, half of it is midbrain, half of it is cortex. You know, the cars running into each other, balls flying all over the place. This is playing with physics, that's a cool interaction. The other half is them watching, from a first-person perspective, somebody open a piece of chocolate candy. And that's and if I were to look, I have videos in the talk show. The two things, one, I think I'm happy exploring and augmenting and virtualizing and extending and allowing new models to sort of be part of the society that my kids grew up in. And the other one is just a hack into a system that we share with fish. And I think that's the one that Facebook hacked. And so I really would like to, we should think harshly about what we want.
Dylan, are you aware of that split between the two different kinds of good in your work?
I thought you
Can
could
you
talk about
see
the
it?
brain then for a moment. Terrify me. No, I don't know how my brain works. Sorry, about the two types of good.
In your work, are you aware of that distinction of different kinds of satisfaction? And presumably that starts to tap into questions of safety and questions of, you know, how good is this for children? How safe are these?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in traditional game design, it's the whole idea of levels and reward and those kind of things. In VR at the moment, in VR in relation to gaming, I don't think it's there yet about thinking of what a level or what necessarily it would be within the virtual space itself. In terms of addiction, I mean, that's something that comes up with kids a lot. And lots of people who are making content specifically for kids are just like, we're going to put a timer in there that blocks them out. And they have to do some complicated maths equation to get back in. As a safety measure.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm saying I don't really know. So I think what is happening with VR is that people started off. So with apps, you could apply a lot of the stuff that was on computer gaming to apps and stuff in the virtual world. It becomes something very different. And I think everyone is just kind of like flying around in the dark trying to work it out. And that's artists, gamers, people are looking at it from neuroscience point of view.
You have William, you have a quite well worked out hedonistic philosophy.
So I think the thing that I think humans are very good with irony. You know, so this is ironic. This doesn't exist, but it looks real. And I think people enjoy irony. And actually, so people become more sophisticated than chopping up pastry or vegetables, whatever. They want intellectual delight. You know, so all the stuff like, all the pleasurable stuff, like chiseling, that's sort of labor, So I think irony, people really like irony. And in emails, we're dealing with abstract models. The whole time we're dealing with ideas. So we're becoming more and more abstracted in some ways. So I think irony is the thing that people like, probably. I think, and that's why people like games. They like, film. So I know it's not real. People like fake things that are fake.
But is there also like a level at which we like a particular aesthetic, or in the same way that I can go into a comic shop and flip through and go, that's not for me. It's the wrong kind of visual style. you know, this book is not...
I think so, but I think people want more. They get bored. They want more. They want something new.
But there's not enough of it for people
Not
to build
enough
up
of it,
that
yeah.
expertise as to what they actually want. Yeah, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good debate.
It's cool. I would like to... Time to open it up. I think my watch is slow. I think we should open this up to the to you. If you can have a think about questions, I'll ask. I want to ask something first to give you a chance of how to address this panel and this conversation. I suppose the last thing I wanted to ask was what happens when the virtual or augmented environment actually takes on agency of its own. We have the children's response of, you know, actually trying to make friends with the fish was quite striking. And there is that, you know, if as AI develops, as, you know, everyone's talking about the Internet of Things, and it's going to be one of those terms which is vaporware for about 20 years, and then we'll suddenly realize that we're living in it, and it actually turned out to be real. Can we enrich our environment or just abstract it with this technology? Can it be genuinely enriching? Just a value statement before we open this open. Yeah,
Yes.
sure. Yeah.
Of course.
So very quickly, for me, often the split between reality and unreal reality becomes quite a problem. So late at night, before I go to bed, I'm often using the Mutated VR, trying things out. Then I go to sleep. So I spent like an hour and a half in VR with these strange mutant things. So I wake up in the middle of the night, having had a terrible dream, searching for the controllers in the bed. I can't find them anywhere because I'm looking for the controllers to switch the dream off. So I cannot distinguish between what's reality or VR. And it's quite, you know, my partner, she's woken up as I'm trying to find the controls because I just want to get out of the experience. So I think there may be some long-term risk of spending too long in VR. Because actually it can change the way you perceive reality, I think.
I think with watching the developers at Dubit, like they often are underwhelmed by reality when they have spent a whole day. Everything's a bit duller. You cannot change where the sun is in the sky. You cannot, like it is an actual thing that people have written about, this kind of VR hangover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite scary. But
Adam, do you think it can be genuinely enriching? And are we looking at the technology to make it enriching, or are we looking at the strategies that we use as we apply this material to make it an enriching experience?
I mean, the history of humans in the last 10,000 years has been a project of using tools to make enrichment, right?
Yeah.
Like in this, you know, Steven Pinker's recent book points out very clearly, like, we've made a lot of progress. There's a lot of things that we maybe don't like about now, but I don't have to worry about generally it doesn't make sense to have to worry about my kid suffering some serious illness and losing a child, which was the norm 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Thank you, last 100 years of science and tech. And that said, I don't think it's ever worth, you always have to really think about how these tools interact with, actually, I'll use an example. 100 years ago, roughly 120 or so, there was the Industrial Revolution. Things that were old labor became somewhat more automated, and this was a huge transformation for what society thought of as doing and work. Yeah. And there were lots of responses to this, and I think it's sort of reflecting a similar range that is much broader than even here on this panel. The one I like was the arts and crafts movement. And I say this from realizing that the arts and crafts movement shares a lot of my philosophies about, well, wait a second. All these new tools have affected us in profound ways. Let's understand that. Not throw them away. Not the Luddites. Not a Luddite. I think I'm an arts and crafts style. I actually grew up, I realized only later, in a small town in upstate New York, which was the center of the American arts and crafts movement. But for us, it was just the place where we had football dinner. But in reality, they made amazing furniture. And they figured out, actually, these textiles that are now being built in looms in Massachusetts, there's a way to understand the materials, to extend that, and from knowing our tools and having control over them, a new, not only new technology, new crafts, but also a new understanding of them emerged. We need the arts and crafts movement too, and that has to happen given what happened in the information technology revolution. We need to now understand what we just did. And I think that's actually going to be really powerful. Then we'll know what to make. And I feel like that's what you guys are doing.
Over to you.
Well, I think the intention was to be able to take one or two questions from the floor whilst the panel's there. But I'm conscious you've also been sitting for quite a while, and the bar is there too. So maybe we just see if you could hold the compound for a little longer. We just see if there are one or two pressing questions from the floor. What we're really keen is you get to speak to each other and to the speakers as well. So if there is a question that somebody would just like to put while we've got the whole panel, Simon will be happy to take that and have a look for you if you're all dying to get to the bar.
Can I ask a quick question to the audience? How many of you are making stuff in VR? How many of you have been in VR? Everyone. More than 10 times?
Well, thank you all. Yes. Hello.
I'll try with one. Well, thank you. I mean, you gave us lots of different stimuli. So, okay, my question is, if you didn't have to do anything of what you're doing because you get paid for it, what would you not be doing? So what would you drop of what you're doing if it wasn't related somehow to getting paid for it?
If we rendered the world properly playful, what would that look like? How would that change? I guess is the
I think it's human nature to try to make everything that isn't playful, playful. That's like you're doing a really boring office job. You know, try to race your chair down the aisle with the person next to you or whatever. I mean, it's human nature to try to do that. I like all parts of my job, so that's quite hard. Okay, I would stop trying to make educational content. So boring. And kids don't want it, you know. They know when you're trying to trick them, going, you know, here's something that's fun, but we're going to teach you something. It's not instantly not fun.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'd stop doing. Yeah. Education comes out of everything.
It's a personal question, is it?
A personal question, yeah.
Okay. Oh, gosh. But yeah, I'm really enjoying everything at the moment, you know. So, you know, students can be quite a lot of work, but actually 3 years later, they want to work with you and really talented, and you get a huge return, a bit like children growing up. That's always a nice surprise. So I always think, well, it'd be good to get rid of all my students, MSc ones. But actually, when I think about it, I'm working with several now, and it's great. So you have to kind of look after some of them to get that return. That sounds a bit clinical. Yeah, what I would say is the challenge, you know, I was in the games industry and I had a company of about 70 people and I was not enjoying it. And it takes you a long time. The one bit of knowledge I learned, it takes you a long time to get out of a situation where you're not enjoying it. And then eventually I became a professor at Goldsmith, got everything back on track, and then everyone said, well, what have you been doing for 10 years, William? So I think that's the one thing I'm really enjoying everything now, but it's very, if you get into that position where it's not good, just get out as quickly as you can. That's the only thing I can say.
Having worked at the Institute of, what was the wonderful name of the institute?
Center for the Unknown.
The Centre for the Unknown.
Can't tell you where it is.
Twinned with the Centre for the Unwary, I hope, somewhere in the world.
Yeah, good question. I'm entirely done with being an academic. I think it's not the right time to be a neuroscientist. We need paid the bills. It gave me a chance to think about things that I would have thought about anyway. Right now, everybody's doing neuroscience. Everybody spends your whole life trying to figure out how your brain fits into the world. We lack the tools we need to play around with what we know about ourselves, how we coordinate amongst ourselves, and those tools need to be built, and they're not going to be built in academia. And so I'm done with that. Don't tell my boss.
It's just been like
It's okay, it's a secret.
Well, thank you. Just remains for me, before I get out of the way and allow you to have a drink and talk to the panel. I would just like to say my thanks to Dylan, to William, and to Adam. I'm Simon. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
and
Simon.
bar!